Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm pretty excited about what I'm going to get started this week. I've decided I'm going to do a whole series of podcast episodes on the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge. So what I'm going to do is introduce the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge and just very loosely explain many of the options as to how Christians have dealt with that here. And then in the coming weeks, might be coming months, I'm going to have on various people who represent some of those perspectives so that they can talk about it more in depth. So that should be a pretty fun and in-depth way of digging into this problem more in advance, and I'm really looking forward to the good conversations I'm going to get to have with people. So before I get started with that, I've got another Facepalm and Sigh Award of the week to give out, and, well, this one's not quite as bad as some of the other ones we give out. Maybe we should just call it a Sigh Award without the facepalm. I don't know. You judge and see how bad you think it is after I explain it. So the context here is that myself and a lot of other people have been playing a computer game called Civilization for many years. I can remember playing this as a teenager 25 years ago. It's up to its sixth version now. There's been 6 of them. And they recently released a update for it, and that's what the context of this is. Now, this is a game where you take human civilization from the Stone Age all the way up to launching a spaceship to go to another planet or Mars or something like that. And then you build wonders, cities, military units, you fight each other. It's a long-term strategy game. It's always been renowned for being complex and at times difficult to play, but enjoyable nonetheless. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I've played all 6 of them. So this last week, it was actually on Valentine's Day, they released the latest expansion pack, the latest update for Civilization 6. It's called Gathering Storm. And what this one does is a little different than any prior ones, where it adds the element of climate change. And it's pretty typical for what you'd expect from that. You build factories, in the game anyway, you build factories, industrialize, start pumping out carbon emissions, the polar ice caps melt and sea levels start rising, and then later on the game gives you technologies to deal with that, such as you can build windmills and solar panels instead, you can build seawalls around your cities to protect against the rising seas, that kind of thing. And I've been playing it a little bit since it came out, and it's actually a fun game. It adds some more interesting dynamics to it, where you have to try to balance. Do you want to have all the production benefits you get from industrialization, or is it more worthwhile to kind of forgo that and not have the sea levels rise and things along those like that happen? Now, when this expansion got announced that they were adding this element to the game, a lot of long-term fans of the series were kind of surprised, because Civilizations tended to avoid political things, in that you can even have things like fascism as a government there, and they've even included Hitler as one of the leaders of Germany at times. It's just kind of been apolitical like that, where it tries to take a more broad historical perspective in the sense of, well, these are the things humans have done, so we're going to put it in the game. It's been part of human civilization. But at the same time, civilization has always kind of had a very optimistic spirit, which is, it kind of presents this mystique or this idea that civilization is progressing, that we're continually getting better. And so putting something in that's a bit more negative, where we're, at least in this game anyway, affecting the planet negatively, is not in keeping with kind of the spirit of the game. It's always had a very philosophically modern idea like that mankind is continually getting better, that things are improving. And so naturally this hasn't been out for even a week yet, and so since they've actually frayed into a little bit of political stuff with climate change and things like that now, somebody over at the gaming website Kotaku, that's Kotaku, actually wrote a little article that says, quote, "Civilization has helped me feel slightly less terrible about climate change." And this was written by a guy named Luke Plunkett. And you can go find his article and read it if you want. If you're interested in the Civilization game series, it might be worth your read. You're probably not going to enjoy it or get much out of it if it's not. And so in his words, he tends to sit around and look at Twitter and all the news feeds all day. I guess it's part of his job. And just feels awful about how apparently climate change, according to him, is destroying the planet, and there's little or nothing that anybody can do about it. And so playing Civilization's Expansion Gathering Storm, where climate change starts destroying the planet in the game, and then you can turn around and do things about it, like build solar panels instead of coal power plants, build seawalls around your cities, and do kind of some political and diplomatic things about recapturing carbon and stuff like that. Those are all things you can do in the game. He says it made him feel better about what he thinks is actually going on, because there he could, quote, kind of actually do something about it, where he can't do anything about it in the real world. He said, quote, "Basically, you're out there doing stuff. Reading report after report in 2019 about the eroding state of our planet is in part so depressing because it makes us feel so helpless. It can feel like the actions of one person, one community, or one nation just aren't enough." And later on he says, "At least in Civilization 6, there's brief personal solace to be had in rolling up your sleeves and getting to work." So the first reason why this gets my facepalm and sigh award of the week, or maybe just sigh in this case, because this one's not quite as bad as some of the other examples, but anyhow, the reason it gets it this week is because just obviously what this guy is claiming is, hey, there's real problems in the world that I think are horrific, and I feel better about them when I go play a video game. Now, that's just obviously wrong. If there are horrific problems in the world, you should get off your butt and go do something about them. Now, here I'm not trying to get into all the politics of climate change. Maybe that'd be a good thing to do a future episode on, because I know it can be a contentious topic. But whatever you think about it, grant for the sake of the moment this guy's arguments and what he thinks. He clearly thinks it's a big deal that's destroying the world. Well, if it is, then why aren't you trying to do something about it? Why are you just sitting there enjoying playing a video game? And now, I don't know who this person is. Maybe he goes and does some things. Maybe he doesn't. But that's just a really bizarre thing to say. And the fact that he wrote an article about that suggests to me he just sits around and feels depressed about it, and then feels good because in Civilization 6, he can build a seawall around cities to prevent them from getting flooded when the sea levels rise. And then he looks at the real world and figures, I can't do anything about this. Well, that's completely the wrong attitude to take. Just read some history, and you'll find that many of the world's biggest problems were solved by just a couple of people who had some good ideas. And I'm not talking about, like, say, America winning and the Allies winning World War II or something about that. I'm talking about things like how most inventions that have made our lives better were not discovered by committees or large groups of people. They were discovered by one or two people or a small group of friends. Most innovations that actually have improved our lives and made the world a better place, that have advanced civilization, don't come from large groups and movements of people. They tend to come from one or two people who then, in turn around and inspire everybody to take action and do what's right. And in the case of climate change, if this guy really thinks it is a real serious problem, as he seems to think so, it's not like he can't do things, Move to a city where you can take public transportation instead of driving a car. Do things like ride a bike instead. Make a point of buying products from companies that use less resources. There's a whole number of things you can do about this if you're actually serious. If you're worried about how manufactured goods and products like the computer I'm using, the phones we all have and things like that are destroying the environment, stop buying new things. Start buying used ones and working your way through them. There's a lot of things like that you can do if you really are convinced that this is a big problem that will help offset the problem, where if a lot of people started doing those things, there would be a whole lot less production, resources used, etc., etc. And again, I don't want to get into the politics and trying to argue about whether or not it is a problem. My point is, according to this guy, it actually is a problem. And based on what the article says, it seems like he doesn't really do anything but sit around and feel depressed about it, and then feel slightly better when he plays a video game, which is just bizarre and foolish. It's articles and statements like this that make me and many other people not take some advocates of things like climate change very seriously, because it doesn't seem like he's really taking it seriously. For an example, that would be from, say, the other side of the political spectrum. I talked about abortion in my episode last week. And now I'm firmly convinced that that's a horrific evil that has to end, because it's literally killing babies every day. Now, if I sit back and look at that and think, well, what am I going to do? There's been 40, 60 million babies killed and more dying every day. I can't do anything to stop this. It's too big of a problem. Well, that's actually not true. There's a number of things I can do. I can talk about it on the podcast for starters and maybe change some hearts and minds, and then maybe a few less people will have an abortion for that reason. I don't know, but that's something. Myself and other people can do things like donate to crisis pregnancy centers. We can be supportive of young women who get pregnant and tell them that we're going to help them through this hard time of their life rather than shunning them so they feel like they have to run off and get an abortion. That was the lesson I took from Carol Gilligan's study on the subject. So even if a problem seems insurmountable and like there's nothing you can do about it, that's almost actually never true. You can almost always do things at a personal level that are going to affect that problem for good, even if it's a really big thing like abortion or climate change. So this isn't really quite as bad as some of the other Facepalm and Sigh awards I've given out, so maybe we'll just call it the Sigh Award of the Week this time around. And the reason why is if you put Luke Plunkett's article in kind of a form of an argument, it really wouldn't commit a logical fallacy so much as it just have a wrong premise. It would probably go something like, 1, climate change is a huge problem. 2, I can't do anything about it. 3, I feel a little better about it when I can do something in the fictional video game world of Civilization 6. 4, therefore that's better than nothing. Which is not a very good argument, but it's not really logically invalid. The problem is the premise that he can't really do anything about it is just simply not true. There are things you can do about it. There are always things you can do about any problem, even when they seem overwhelming. You're almost never going to be in a situation where there's literally nothing you can do to affect the world around you for good. So, with that done, let's move on to introducing the problem of divine foreknowledge. And now there's a great and wonderful quote from Aristotle he wrote in Metaphysics that I want you to keep in mind here. He said, "Those who wish to succeed must ask the right preliminary questions." Meaning if you're asking the wrong questions, you got the wrong ideas from the start, it's going to be very hard for you to succeed. Well, that's kind of painfully obvious. I probably didn't need to explain that. But I'm a philosopher. I love to over-explain things. So now, what's the problem of divine foreknowledge? Well, it's one of the more common or popular level objections you get to belief in God. It's probably one of the things you're going to hear very often from people who you're just discussing these things with in an everyday environment. And that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about it and do a whole series of episodes on the many possible solutions to it. Because although it's a very common objection, it's not a very good objection in that there's so many possible solutions to it. And I'm going to explain here in this episode why that makes it a bad objection. But as far as what it is, I've actually got an audio clip here I'm going to play from the series on World War II called The Pacific, which, side note, I love war stories. I love good war movies. And this one was pretty good. It's well worth your time to watch if you're into war movies. And of course, it's violent and things like that. It's a series on the war that the Marines fought in the Pacific. But anyhow, a couple of the characters they have a little downtime and they're sitting around in a tent reading books. And one of them notices that the other one is picking up and reading a Bible. And this is the conversation that commences.
Now that explains it. You're a believer.
Yes.
Okay, question. God created everything, right? The heavens, 7 seas, Marine Corps, Sleeping Beauty there.
Even him.
Land crabs, rats, mosquitoes.
That mosquito's a little tough to understand, I guess, but...
God created Japs too, right? Yellow slants who've tried to kill me on many occasions. Japs come from the Garden of Eden too?
Well, what we do is up to us. He gives us a choice.
Free will. Right. Except he's God, of course, so he knows what we're gonna do before we do it.
Predestination.
So the whole game is fixed by the will of Gramps on his throne while we're down here for what? His entertainment? That makes us chumps or God's a sadist, and either way, I got no use for him.
So what do you believe in?
I believe in ammunition.
So it's kind of a smart alecky response, but I do like that line, I believe in ammunition. Now, typically you're going to hear people give objections like this, and this is what the problem of divine foreknowledge is. The guy actually articulated it reasonably well, which is, hey, if God knows that everything we're going to do, how can we be free to do it? Because God being God necessarily knows what we're going to do. He cannot be wrong. So if 3 days ago God knew that I was going to be recording this podcast, and now I am, how could I have possibly chosen to do it? Because since God knew I was going to do it, and God cannot be wrong, I could not have done otherwise. And the definition of free will, as it's commonly understood, is you need to be able to do something or not do it. You need to be able to do otherwise. And typically the problem gets portrayed in everyday media and by people who haven't studied philosophy and theology very much, kind of like this, is, oh, that's a knockdown, drag-out argument. That proves there must be something wrong. And really it isn't. There's at least 5 main responses, solutions to the problem of divine foreknowledge that Christians can give. And some of these options contradict each other. They're not all going to be true. But there's at least 5 possible responses, which are reasonable in the sense that they could be true. And I'm going to just introduce them here, and then we'll go through them more in depth in later episodes as I get people on who are advocates of those positions. So my main goal here in this podcast and the upcoming ones where I'll talk to some more people about these various options is to just demonstrate that, well, this is often presented in popular level as, like it was just there in that audio clip, as, well, hey, that knocks it all down. It's really not. It's really an incredibly weak and very easily answered objection to Christianity. And while people who study it may disagree about which solution is best, there's just a wealth of possible solutions to it. So to begin with, I'm going to define the problem in a little bit more of a formal, technical, and philosophical sense. Now, this problem has been well known and discussed for a long, long time, even as far back as the philosopher Boethius, who lived in the late Roman Empire. He summarized the problem of divine foreknowledge as this, quote, "The two seem clear, contrary, and opposite, God's universal foreknowledge and the freedom of will." More recently, the theologian Greg Boyd has explained it like this, quote, "The impenetrable paradox of asserting that self-determining free actions are settled in eternity." So arguments about the problem of divine foreknowledge, or PDF for shorthand, easier way to say it, well, what they are is attempts to show that there's a contradiction between God's foreknowledge of a human action and that human action being free in any reasonable sense of being free. As Patrick Todd said, quote, "If God knows everything, then no human action is free, and since God knows everything, no human action is free." And that, his argument, is the most important issue here. Likewise, Clark Pinnock says that classically theism has tried to argue that God can control and foresee all things in a world where humans are free. Freedom, however, can exist in this context only in a verbal sense. There is no room for the kind of freedom the Bible speaks of if there is a God who knows and or controls all things in a timeless present. Freedom means that reality is open in a way it cannot be open for such classical theism. And Clark Pinnock is an advocate of a position on this problem called open theism that I'll explain a little later as we go through here. And the guy I mentioned before, Greg Boyd, agrees. He says it's hard to reconcile the belief that all of history is an eternally settled storyline with the belief that temporal agents possess the power to resolve contrary possibilities into actual courses of action. Which is kind of a mouthful, but I'm sure you're getting the point here. Now, Boyd also formally laid out an argument for this in premises, which is what I really like, the way you want to have people lay things out if you can get it that way, because it's a whole lot easier to deal with formal arguments than it is just rhetoric. So his formal argument is, 1. Necessarily, if there is an eternally settled storyline, then Agent A chooses this and not that. 2. Necessarily there is an eternally settled storyline. And 3. Therefore, necessarily Agent A chooses this and not that. And when he's discussing the idea, the popular Christian philosopher William Lane Craig gives a simpler version of the same argument, where his is A. Necessarily, if God foreknows X, then X will happen. B. Necessarily God foreknows X. C. Therefore X will necessarily happen. So if these two arguments work, and they're basically getting at the same idea, if they work, it follows that we're not free, that I'm not freely choosing to do this podcast because God knew 3 days ago, 100 years ago, at the very beginning of time, in the first moment of existence, that I would be doing this, and God cannot be wrong. Now, it should, I hope, be immediately obvious that part of what's going on here is there's a claim that there's a contradiction at work, that when I assert I am free, I can choose to do this and not that. I can choose to drink the cup of coffee or not drink the cup of coffee. And when I assert God foreknows what my choice will be, that there's a contradiction between that something is wrong when I assert both of those, that somewhere buried in the idea that I have free will and buried in the idea that God has foreknowledge, there's a contradiction between those two, so they both cannot be right at the same time. And so what we need to do to work through this and understand it is explain a little bit about what a contradiction actually is. What does it mean when things contradict each other? And now you're probably thinking something along the lines of, oh, come on, I know what a contradiction is. Everybody knows what that does. And in a certain sense, you probably do. We all kind of have a intuitive sense of what contradictions are and the fact that they don't exist. But in the specific sense that you need for this argument, you might not. A lot of people actually don't know what a contradiction is in this specific sense. It's very common that things get labeled as contradictions when they're actually not. So let me give you some examples here. So to start off with, there are actually two main types of contradictions. There's what you would call an explicit contradiction, and then there's an implicit one. Now, explicit contradictions are things that are just flat out on the face of it, obviously contradictions. And two examples that philosophers love to use here are married bachelors and square circles. The definition of a bachelor necessarily contradicts with the definition of being married, so if you say someone's a married bachelor, that's an explicit contradiction. Same thing with circles and squares. The definition of one necessarily excludes the other, so nothing can be a square and a circle at the same time. No man can be married and a bachelor at the same time. Those are explicit contradictions. Now, implicit contradictions are more along the lines of what's going on in the problem of divine foreknowledge, if there is one there. It's where there's a contradiction, but it's kind of buried. It's something that's a little bit harder to see, that you need to dissect and explain things and pull it out. So, for example, you've probably heard some conservative political people try to argue that, say, democracy and socialism are contradictory. Well, they're really not. And the reason why is they're kind of two different systems. Socialism is an economic system that gets then mixed with politics, because all economic systems get mixed with politics, where democracy is strictly a political system. You can have a democracy that is very socialistic. There are plenty of those all over the world, and they're not inherently contradictory. Now, that says nothing about whether or not that works or is a good idea, but the point is you can have the two of them together. And a little bit closer to a contradiction would be, say, capitalism and socialism. At least there you have two economic systems, capitalism versus socialism, and they're not really the same. But even there, you can probably mix them a little bit. Some countries over in Europe actually have kind of capitalistic, free market-driven societies, where then they have a bunch of socialistic programs where you can go found your business and make money, and then the government taxes you and pays for things like school, education, and things along those lines. So they're kind of a mix of it. What's more of an explicit contradiction is, say, something like democracy and totalitarianism, or democracy and a total dictatorship. There you can't have a government that's both democratic and run by a dictator. Those are a contradiction. And just further, I've often heard people claim that there's contradictions all over the Bible. Well, when you look at what they're actually claiming, most of those supposed contradictions are actually no such thing. Here's an easy example. The Gospels report different numbers of angels at Christ's tomb. Mark has a different number than Matthew, and so on and so forth. And some people will look at that and say, ha! That's a contradiction. Well, no, not necessarily. So Matthew and Mark mention only one angel in their accounts of the resurrection, where Luke and John seem to mention two angels. And so people will say, well, there's a contradiction there. Well, again, not necessarily. That certainly is a difference in the account. After all, two is not one. but it's not really a contradiction. Just because Matthew and Mark only mention one angel does not necessarily mean that there weren't two there, and likewise because the other Gospels mention two doesn't necessarily mean that there were only two there. This would only be a strict contradiction if Matthew or Mark said there was one and only one angel at the resurrection, there were no others, and then the other Gospels said there were two. That would be a contradiction. Just because only one is mentioned in the Matthew and Mark, and then the other two mention two angels, that's not a contradiction in a strict sense. It's a difference, and maybe it's a difference that needs an explanation, and I'm not going to get into that here, but it's not a contradiction. Where there's two angels, there's also going to be one angel, just as if where there's two people, there's going to be one. And you could see this in just any kind of eyewitness account you get somewhere else. If the cops are interviewing some people about, say, a crime that happened or something similar to that, and somebody says, well, I saw one guy, and then they're interviewing somebody else who, say, was standing somewhere else in a different position, and says, well, I saw two guys. Are the cops going to say, well, their stories contradict? No, they're going to say, well, the first guy only saw one, or only mentioned one, and the second guy had a different vantage point and saw two people instead. And it could easily be the case that that's what's going on with the Gospels. And again, I'm not claiming it is. All I'm claiming here is that that is not a contradiction. It's a difference, not a contradiction. And many things that people claim where they'll say, oh, the Bible contradicts itself, or that's a contradiction, it's not. It's a difference, and perhaps a difference that needs an explanation of some kind, but probably not a contradiction. There's actually some fairly strict requirements as far as what makes a contradiction. The point here is that a difference or a problem is not necessarily in and of itself a contradiction or a defeater. And a defeater here, what I mean by that, that's a philosophical term. What I mean is simply a belief or fact that shows that another belief or fact that you believe is wrong. So, suppose you read the description of this podcast and know that I live in Missouri, and you decide, Phil was probably born in Missouri. But then you talk to me and I tell you, no, I was born in Minnesota. Well, my telling you that I was born in Minnesota would be a defeater for your belief that I was born in Missouri, and that's all defeaters really are. Now, it's a pretty basic, but not very well-known point in logic that to establish a contradiction, what you need to demonstrate is that there is no possible way for the two things in question to be reconciled. So here's some quick, easy examples. Suppose I tell you that I went to school in Springfield, and then you hear me telling another person that I went to school in Missouri. Well, if you know that Springfield is in Illinois, you might think there's a contradiction at work here. But there isn't, because there's also a Springfield in Missouri. Now, you probably wouldn't think that because it's pretty common knowledge that there's multiple Springfields around in many different states. So you probably wouldn't naturally think that there's a contradiction here. So I'll give you a little harder example. Let's suppose instead that I said that I visited Paris in 2009, but then you overhear me telling another person that I didn't leave the United States in 2009. Now, it's far more likely you'll see a contradiction here because it's less commonly known that there's other towns named Paris than the one in France. In fact, there's a Paris, Missouri that I did drive through in 2009. So it's easy to see this point I'm making here, but the next part of it is a little more subtle. Even if I wasn't in Springfield, Missouri or Paris, Missouri, that those weren't the ones I was referring to, the fact that there are two or more places called Springfield and Paris demonstrates that it's possible for there to be no contradiction in what I said, and therefore there is no contradiction. I can be wrong or lying and still not be making a contradictory claim. If it's even possible to reconcile two seemingly contradictory things, then that shows that there just is no contradiction. The mere possibility shows there's no contradiction, even if it's wrong. So even if I was lying in that particular case, there's no contradiction. I'm just wrong. Saying something is a contradiction is a stronger claim than just saying that it's wrong. Contradictions have pretty strict requirements. So I'm going to go back to the problem of divine foreknowledge now. Suppose someone argues that there is a contradiction between God knowing what my future actions will be and my claim that I am free while I perform those actions. Now, in a certain sense, I can certainly see why it might appear that way. But all I need to do to demonstrate that there is no contradiction is just present a logically possible way of reconciling those two. Just like the above fact of two or more places named Paris and Springfield removes that contradiction, so the existence of a logically possible solution to the problem of divine foreknowledge removes that contradiction and destroys the problem. So, briefly here are the 5 main responses that Christian philosophers, theologians, and other Christian thinkers have offered to the problem of divine foreknowledge. One that's gained a lot of popularity recently, thanks to the work of philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig, is called Molinism, and it's actually named after Luis Molina, who was a Jesuit. I forget which century he was in. Anyhow, he was a Jesuit in the Middle Ages, and he came up with this system or this idea that answers, possibly at least, the problem of divine foreknowledge. Loosely speaking, what it claims is that God uses middle knowledge, that is, knowledge of what we would do in certain situations or contexts, to arrange the world so that we freely do what he wants or needs us to do. The technical term for this are what we would call conditionals or sometimes counterfactuals, depending on how you're speaking about them. But the idea is, if you were in a different circumstance, you would behave differently. So, if you had been born to different parents, well, your life would be different and you would behave differently. And God knows, being God, how you would behave differently. And that's all the way from very big things like having a different parents to small things like, would you behave differently if your coffee got a little colder this morning faster? Well, maybe you would. And if you would, God knows that. Example that I like to use is, there aren't a whole lot of restaurants in the town my wife and I live in, and we really wish there were. So what I say is, if there were more restaurants in this town, my wife and I would eat at them. That's what's going on there. And if that is something we would do, God definitely knows about it. So for whatever reason, God has arranged it so that there aren't a lot of different opportunities in different restaurants in this town for my wife and I to eat out at, because we would go do that more often if there were. Or another good example that I used to use back in college when I was much more of a coffee fiend drinker than I am now is, suppose that I'm on a road trip and I stop at a gas station. Well, I'm going to get a cup of coffee because that's what I do. Or at least that's what I did then. I don't do it as often now because as you get older, you unfortunately can't drink as much coffee. It's a terrible thing. Another example of evil in the world. But it used to be the case that I would. And God would know that, being God. So he could arrange the world in such a way that the fact that Phil gets coffee when he stops at the gas station on a road trip, at least Phil did when he was in his 20s, that's something he can use. And you can see how that can be extrapolated to all kinds of different things. God wanted Paul to write the book of Romans. Well, God would know, if Paul is in Rome when he writes Romans, it will be this. If he was instead in, say, Ephesus or Alexandria, it would be this. I want it to be what it's going to be when Paul's in Rome. Therefore, I'm going to arrange the world so that Paul will be in Rome, and then Paul will freely write what I want him to write. And that's just a simple example. It obviously would be immensely complicated to the point where only God could figure out all those pieces. But you can kind of see, at least I hope, how on a simple logical sense that works, or at least could work. Now, there are two general objections to this. The first one that often gets thrown around is the grounding objection, which is, well, where do we find these conditionals, these counterfactuals? Where do they exist in the world? They're kind of these abstract things where we can say them as if-thens, but how do they exist? And furthermore, how would they exist in such a way that God can know them even before he creates all of us? And that gets kind of technical and complicated, but that's an objection that's thrown around. Another objection is that this makes God dependent on human beings, in the sense that God's knowledge of what I'm going to do is dependent on me, on what I'm actually going to do. That is, in the Molinist scheme of things, I'm not going to do what I'm going to do tomorrow because God knows it. Rather, God knows what I'm going to do tomorrow because it is what I'm going to freely do. It kind of reverses it, so to speak. And under some conceptions of how some philosophers and theologians want to think about God, that's a problem because it makes God's knowledge dependent on human beings. And God as the necessary ultimate being, well, we don't really want to think about him as being dependent on us in any way. We actually kind of want it to be the other way around. So that's Molinism, simply put. The second option I'll talk about here is what I would want to call the Thomistic or the divine timelessness option. Now, it's Thomistic in the sense, Thomism is a type of philosophy that's derived from St. Thomas Aquinas, and this was Aquinas' answer. He's not the only one who answered it this way. Many philosophers have answered it this way and still do to this day. But divine timelessness is, just loosely speaking, the idea that God sits outside of time, and therefore he can see everything that's going on because he's not affected or bound by time like we are. This is a little comparable to how, say, you're watching a movie. Well, in a certain sense, you sit outside of the timeline of the movie. You can rewind, you can fast forward, you can watch it again. If you have a particular type of Blu-ray player, DVD player, you could even watch the movie backwards if you wanted to. Most of them don't do that, but it's at least possible. And so you can watch it and then look back and see things again the second time around. And it's not like if you're watching the movie for a second time, a third time, or a fourth time, if it's something you really like, that the fact that you know what those characters are going to do in any way makes them do it. The characters do things of their own volition, and so to speak, have the life of their own, make their own choices, and yet you still know what they're going to do. And that's kind of how the divine timelessness thing works. And it can get more nuanced and complicated than that. All these views can get more nuanced and complicated than I'm going to present here, and hopefully that's something we'll get into when I get advocates for these positions on the program. And like the divine timelessness one, that's one that when I was asked this question of my dad when I was a little kid, that's how he explained it to me, is, God just sits outside of time, and so he sees everything that's going on, and that's the answer to this problem. Now, the general criticism that's usually leveled at divine timelessness is that simply removing God from time doesn't really solve the problem, which is the idea is this is a logical contradiction that isn't affected by time. The idea of this critique being that, well, causation occurs even in timeless things. Just taking God out of time, well, it could still be the case that there's the problem of his knowledge causing things. That is, if the problem is God knew yesterday that I was going to do this podcast today, therefore I didn't choose to do this podcast, simply taking God out of time doesn't seem to remove that contradiction. So that's the usual critique that's given of that position. Now, then there's also a option that I think is relatively new, theologically speaking. I think it first came about probably 40 or 50 years ago. That's called open theism. And it's not really a strict system. It's more, open theism is kind of a catch-all term for many different ideas that kind of have a similar theme. But the loose idea of it is that God actually doesn't know the future. That is, the future is open, hence the name open theism. And if you're at all familiar with the Christian conception of God, you're going to immediately go, well, wait a minute, God's omniscient. He knows everything. How could he not know the future? And the way open theists get around that is they then posit, well, the future is something that can't really be known, at least not in an absolute sense. The future is a contradiction. It's something along the lines of like the square circle or married bachelor. Now, if knowledge of future events really is a contradiction, then obviously it seems that God couldn't know it because contradictions just can't exist. And so that's the, loosely speaking, open theist claim. We all agree that God knows everything in reality. We're simply claiming knowledge of future events is not part of reality. And again, they get more nuanced and specific than that, but that loosely speaking, that's it. Now, the general criticism I think most people who give of this view, there's again more technical and nuanced criticisms, is that, well, it just seems pretty counterintuitive to claim we don't have knowledge of the future, that it's impossible or a contradiction to have knowledge of the future, because it really seems like most of us have knowledge of the future most of the time. At least to some degree we do, in the sense that, well, I'm pretty confident the sun's going to rise tomorrow, even though that's in the future. And there's other examples that I would be less certain of, like, I'm pretty confident I'm going to have a cup of coffee tomorrow. Not as confident that the sun will rise. I'm pretty confident that one of my kids is going to whine and scream at me tomorrow, because my daughter's not yet 3 and my son's only not even a year old. So that's what they're going to do. They're kids. And I'm not as confident of that as I am that the sun's going to rise, but I'm more confident of it than I am that I'm going to have a cup of coffee. So it seems like I have some knowledge of the future. So why would it be different for God? Now, there's also a viewpoint that's called simple foreknowledge, which essentially posits that, well, God knows the future, he's unable to change it or affect it in any way. Greg Boyd said that of this simple foreknowledge view, it holds that God simply knows what will take place, but cannot alter it in light of this knowledge. The fact that God foreknows what will occur does not increase his control over what occurs. So, under this view, loosely speaking, God's kind of like Dr. Manhattan from that comic Watchmen, or the movie, which wasn't really as good. But anyhow, the character Dr. Manhattan in the comic Watchmen, he's very much like a Superman, divine being human in that comic universe, and he sees everything that is in the past and the future, but he sees it in a very deterministic sense where he can't really see it and change it. He just sees things and knows what's going to happen in the future, but he's kind of causally effete in that he can't really do anything about it. It's sort of like how you can see a rock rolling down the hill, and you know, well, it's going to continue to roll down the hill, but most of the time you can't do anything about it. Well, that's how he sees everything, but he not only sees the rocks rolling down the hill, he sees the future choices people will make, and so on and so forth. And that's what simple foreknowledge, loosely speaking, turns God into. And now the immediate objection I think I'd have to that is, well, you don't really want to think of God as causally effete like that. If I had knowledge of future events, it certainly seems that I would use that to change things. Seems that way anyway. There's some science fiction stories that suggest otherwise, where knowledge of the future, you have it and then you can't really change anything. In fact, some of the better science fiction stories I've seen and read are ones where you have knowledge of the future and you try to change it, and you actually bring about the very thing that you're trying to prevent. Star Trek did a couple episodes like that, and the show on Netflix about people from the future called Travelers kind of hit on that theme in its last season, which is interesting, good science fiction. But that'd be my objection is, well, if it seems like if I had knowledge of the future, I could use it, why can't God? And the last more mainstream option I'll talk about here is Calvinism. Now, Calvinism is a little unlike these other options in that it isn't just an answer to the problem of divine foreknowledge. Rather, it's a whole big, giant, and very sophisticated theological system. There's a whole lot more to it than just an answer to the problem of divine foreknowledge, but at the same time, it is an answer. And what it does is it essentially accepts that there is a contradiction between having free will and God knowing what you're going to do, and then it essentially says, well, you don't have free will, at least not in the sense that libertarian free will defines it. You don't have free will in the sense of you could have done this and not other. What it tends to do, and again, it depends on which Calvinist theologian or philosopher you're reading or talking to, but typically what it does is it redefines free will to mean you can do what you want to do. That is, you want to sin, well, you can do that, therefore you're free, even if you couldn't have done other than sin. You smell a cookie, you want to eat it, you do, well, you're free to do that, even if you actually couldn't have not eaten the cookie. Now, that's a counterintuitive definition of free will, that it's not really the way most of us would want to define free will. And that's the usual objection that's, I'd say, leveled against Calvinism. The other typical objection is that it seems like it turns God into somebody who's holding people accountable for things wherein they had no choice. So, if it is the case that you don't have free will in the sense of you could have done this and not that, you could have sinned and not sinned, then how is it fair, right, or just for God to hold you accountable for something you could not have done? If you have no way of not sinning, then how is it just that God holds you to account for sinning? And those are the two typical objections that are raised against Calvinism, generally speaking. And of course, there's more and less sophisticated versions and variants of all of these views, and there's people who nuance them in specific ways. Just a very easy example of this. The guy who's generally credited with reviving Molinism in the contemporary world is Alvin Plantinga, who kind of just stumbled across the idea in some of his work and then only later found out that Luis Molina had came up with the idea first, which was probably a depressing day for him. Well, anyhow, Plantinga is a Calvinist in every other sense of the word. He comes from a Dutch Reformed church and he taught at Calvin College. And yet, he, as far as the problem of divine foreknowledge goes, he holds to Molinism, but he's a Calvinist in probably pretty much every other sense of the word, at least as far as I'm aware. And so you'll probably find, if you do a lot of reading in philosophers and theologians on this, that you're going to find some nuance and people varying things up a bit. But those are the 5 general approaches that people have taken. And my intention is to get somebody on the podcast here who represents each one of those views, and we'll have more nuanced and in-depth conversations about that particular view, where we'll talk about its strengths, its weaknesses, offer some critiques, see how they respond to the critiques, and, have some really good discussions like that. And my main point here is that if any one of these 5 views is right, there is no problem of divine foreknowledge. And as best as I can tell, all of them are internally coherent. All of them are at least possible. Therefore, what I'm going to submit is there really is no problem of divine foreknowledge in the sense of a contradiction that proves Christianity is false. It just isn't there. Because all you need is one of these 5 to work, and at least possibly one of the 5 work. Now, at the same time, I've been kicking around my own idea on the problem of divine foreknowledge for a while now, which we could consider a 6th option, which is to simply turn around and deny the problem. And I think you might be able to do this based on what the definition of knowledge and the definition of free will is. So, what's the nature of divine knowledge and free will, and is there a contradiction in affirming both of them? Well, loosely speaking, the nature of knowledge and what it means to know is controversial in philosophical circles, but a good general definition is that knowledge is justified true belief. And if you want to hear some more discussion on that, go back to podcast 14. Sarah Geis and I talked about that a little bit toward the end of the episode, and I thought that was a good and fruitful discussion. Now, as justification is only appropriate for and necessary for limited and finite beings, divine knowledge, that is God's knowledge, would simply be true belief. God needs no justification for his beliefs, because he's always right. The whole point of having justification is to help you be right. So let's assume, for the sake of argument discussion here, that God's knowledge is similar in nature to our knowledge, to non-divine knowledge, and then we can infer a few things. Now, before I get to that, you might object that, wait, it's not reasonable to infer that the nature of divine knowledge and the nature of human knowledge are similar enough that we can infer things. And that's a reasonable argument to make. It's reasonable to argue that God is so other from human beings that the nature of knowledge as we study it in epistemology is in no way analogous to whatever the nature of God's knowledge is. However, if that's the case, that immediately eliminates the problem of divine foreknowledge. The problem is that there seems to be an incompatibility or contradiction between God's foreknowledge of a human choice and that same choice being free. But if God's knowledge is too other and mysterious to reason about, if it's just so unlike what we think about knowledge that we can't plug it in like that, then it follows that no one's in a position to really know that there is such a contradiction. You can't reasonably assert a contradiction between something that is unknown and anything else. If you don't know what it is, how do you know that it contradicts anything? So if you want to go in that direction, it just seems to me that intuitively there is no problem of divine foreknowledge. So going back, grant the assumption that divine and non-divine knowledge are similar enough that that line of reasoning is valid, and then we can infer some things. It's easy to see that knowledge is always knowledge of, which means knowledge requires that there be an other. In order to know something, there must be a knower, the person who knows, and the thing that is known. So if I'm going to know about my cup of coffee, that requires there be me and the cup of coffee. Now, D.Q. McInerny will take this a step further, and he's argued that there's a trinity within knowledge. That is, there's the knower, there's the knowledge itself, and then there is the thing that is known. So in that case, there'd be me, my knowledge of the coffee cup, my belief of the coffee cup, and then there's the thing that is known, which is the coffee cup itself. Now, what follows here is that knowledge is an inherently relational activity. An agent knows things, and knows is a verb. As William Wallace has explained, knowledge never occurs except in the framework of subject-object relatedness. That is the cup me and the coffee cup. So, in divine knowledge, God knows things that are other than himself, or as Aquinas said, God necessarily knows things other than himself. Without there being an other to be known, God would not have knowledge of it, and this fits perfectly well with the standard definition of omniscience. God is omniscient in the sense that he knows everything that there is to know, everything that can be known. He knows all true propositions. But where there are not truths, there is nothing for an omniscient being to know. It follows from this that while everything other than God gets its ontological status, that is being or existence, from God, God's knowledge seems to get its epistemic content from those things that are other than God. And again, as I referenced above, some people might object to this, but if we're going to claim that God's knowledge that divine knowledge is similar to ours, then that just seems to follow, because that's how human knowledge works. Now also, as the Christian God is a trinity, this definition of knowledge just inherently alludes right back to him. If God is three persons in one, then there is always another person for him to be in relation to, even if he exists by himself. And the fact that there's a trinity of knowledge, that the very way to know things seems to be a trinity right within the very fabric of reality, seems to point back to him as well. Now, I'd also want to argue that adding the prefix for to knowledge doesn't seem to fundamentally change the nature of what's going on here. It doesn't seem to change the nature of what it means to know, as that simply places knowledge within time. Thus, to foreknow an event will simply mean to know it before it occurs. Now, I don't think there really is an in-principle objection to foreknowledge itself, contra what the open theist will claim. Every human being seems to demonstrate foreknowledge every day. An astronomer foreknows what the positions of the stars and planets will be in a month, in a certain sense. A child routinely foreknows when his favorite TV show will start. Well, at least they did when things ran on a schedule. Now everything's DVR and streamed, so that example's not very good anymore, but you can still see the point. A wife will foreknow the approximate time her husband will get home from work. Now, obviously in some instances, such foreknowledge can be wrong. Perhaps that child's TV show was preempted for breaking news, or maybe bad traffic causes the husband to arrive home considerably later than he usually does. But this is principally no different than any other type of knowledge we have or talk about. It's always possible that knowledge we have turns out to be wrong. A person may have knowledge that a certain mathematical formula or logical argument is sound, only to have it later demonstrated that it is unsound. And this gets a little dicey with the standard definition of knowledge that it's justified true belief. But generally speaking, sometimes in epistemology people would want to get around this by saying, well, if you were wrong, it turns out you didn't have knowledge. And you can certainly go that route, but that doesn't really seem to affect the point I'm making here, which is simply saying, well, it's knowledge in time, it's knowledge before the fact. Somehow that doesn't fundamentally change what's going on here. All it does is add a little nuance to it. But furthermore, as God is omniscient, his knowledge is necessarily true and cannot be wrong. Thus, divine knowledge is simply God knowing something other than himself in advance of the time that thing actualizes. So it's him knowing that I was going to do this podcast yesterday, the day before, and so on back to the very beginning of time. Now, there's several different ways people have defined free will, as I talked about earlier. The philosopher Victor Ruppert has said, it is the ability to do other than we actually do in the exact same circumstances we are in. The theologian Greg Boyd gave a very similar definition where he said, an agent can be said to possess libertarian free will if it lies within his or her power to do otherwise. And the philosopher William Lane Craig has argued a little differently that what makes a person's choice free is the absence of any causally determining factors of his choosing X. So practically speaking, what I think all these definitions are telling us, if we combine them all, what it seems is that In order for a person, say Phil, me, to have free will, it must be the case that with respect to decision X, say whether or not I drink a cup of coffee, I could have chosen X, or I could have chosen Y, to have tea instead, and that this choice must have been directly caused by nothing other than me. It is important here to draw a distinction between what I'll call direct and indirect causations. For free will to be true, I must, in at least some decisions, be the only direct cause of that decision. So if I have free will, then me, and only me, must have direct causal power over my choice to do X or Y, in this case, drink coffee or tea. Now, an indirect causation would be something like influences that are put on me, like the day before I saw an advertisement for coffee, so when I wake up I'm thinking about that and decide I'm going to go get coffee. Well, that didn't cause me to do it in the same sense as my will did, but it certainly influenced me. And so there's influences on all of our decisions, but those aren't necessarily going to be direct cause. So that's the distinction I'm making there. Now, of course, much more can and should be said about definitions of the nature of knowledge and free will. These are extremely philosophically controversial and rich topics, and so I've only briefly gone through them here. But for the purpose of what I'm doing here, I think we can adequately say that knowledge is an activity of knowing an other, and free will means that a person, and only that person, has direct control over his actions. So then in regards to the problem of divine foreknowledge, the question is there a contradiction between the following two statements? 1, God has foreknowledge of Phil's actions. And 2, Phil, and only Phil, has direct causal power over his actions. Or you could just say Phil has free will, but that's not quite as explicit as I want it to be here. Now, it seems to me that on face value, there's just no obvious contradiction between these two statements. You can find a contradiction if you bring other ideas and definitions to bear and insert them here, but if you're working off those definitions I just gave for what knowledge is and what free will is, then it seems that there just is no contradiction. For example, if you assume that God's foreknowledge makes Phil's actions necessary, that would conflict with me and only me having direct causal power over my actions. But see, this is bringing an assumption that there's something different about God's knowledge wherein it's necessary. And not just that God is always right. Saying it's that God's foreknowledge makes it necessary I do something is a much stronger statement than just saying God is always right, or God is by definition right. Saying that his foreknowledge makes my actions necessary is a much stronger statement. So if you go off of the definitions of free will and knowledge that I just worked on from here, with a good basic understanding of those definitions, there just doesn't seem to be a problem of divine foreknowledge. If such a conflict does exist, it's still buried somewhere in those concepts that are and definitions that are at work in those two statements I gave, number 1 and 2. And what I think and probably want to argue is that any attempts to just find something there are going to be reading something like that back into it. They're going to be reading just an assumption that there's something necessary going on there. That is, they're going to be assuming there's a problem that needs to be fixed. And so that's one of the ways I would want to go about denying the problem. And it seems to me that the definition of free will, which is the ability to do this and not this, the ability to have chosen differently than we did choose, is just kind of intuitively obvious. That's the way we all tend to just intuitively think about free will. The possible objection I see coming in is, well, you just can't reason about God's knowledge that way. Divine knowledge is just too different, too other. But if you're going to go that route, it seems to me then you just kind of have to throw the whole problem of divine foreknowledge out, because if you can't reason about God's knowledge, if it's too other, then it's unknown, and it's something you can't construct a logical contradiction out of. And in order for the problem of divine foreknowledge to work, for it to be a real problem, you have to have a contradiction there. Okay, so I'm pushing at the time a little bit here, but I wanted to do another segment on arguments for the existence of God. So one type of argument that, when I explained how Kant classified them, that he didn't list was the moral argument. And that's because he probably would have considered it falling into cosmological arguments. At least if we interpret him charitably, that would be a way we could classify it. Or I think it's More likely he just left it out because who knows why. But anyhow, moral arguments are typically the idea that because there's morality, therefore there has to be God. You can formally put it something like this. If there are moral absolutes, there must be a God. There are moral absolutes, therefore there's a God. Now, I've found that these tend to be some of the more compelling arguments among people who are not quite as philosophically trained. And that's I don't find that to be a detriment on those people or these arguments. I think they tend to be good arguments. And of course, there's variations of them. Since there isn't a lot of time, I won't cite a specific one and go through it in detail. I'll just give you kind of a overview of how they work. The idea here is that morality needs a foundation. That is, it needs an ontological foundation where it can get its status as morality. This is analogous to how if you want to have a house that's going to stand up, that house better have a foundation. You remove the foundation and there's nothing underneath it. And that's, metaphysically speaking, what we mean when we say that morality has to have an ontological foundation. And you can say this in a simpler and easier to understand way, that is, laws require a lawgiver. If there's a law, there has to be an authority that issued that law. So, in the case of legality in the United States, it's the U.S. government, the state government, maybe it's the local county or the city you're in, but you can see how there's an authority issuing that law. And so the idea of the first premise of the argument, if there are moral absolutes, there must be a God, is that, essentially that if there are things that are really right and wrong in the world, if there are some lines that you should never cross, and if there are some things that are always good, there must be someone who made it that way, who gave us those laws, who's the lawgiver, so to speak, who's the authority from which it comes. And now, generally, most people are not going to challenge you on the second premise of this argument, that there are moral absolutes. You do meet a few crazy, foolish people who claim they're moral relativists who don't believe in moral absolutes, but realistically speaking, they pretty much always do. Find something they care about and it's salted, and suddenly they're going to be moral absolutists. Now, I'm not suggesting you actually do that, because that's rude and unkind and you'd be behaving immorally. I'm just making the point that everyone really does believe in moral absolutes, even if they claim otherwise. The most common objection I think you tend to hear to this type of argument is actually kind of a confusion of the argument. And that is, what people will tend to do is they'll confuse moral ontology, which is what the first premise of the argument is about, with moral epistemology. So they'll respond by saying things like, oh, well, those people in that other culture or on that other side of the world have different moral absolutes than we do. And that's just a complete misunderstanding of the argument. The fact that some other group of people or some other people think morality is different in no way affects the argument. What it says is, if there are moral absolutes, then there's a God that grounds them. There's a foundation. There's a foundation that's necessary. It says nothing about whether or not other people have different ideas about morality or whether or not other people are wrong. And further, that's generally not a very educated objection, because when you actually look at most cultures, when you research them, generally speaking, morality is actually pretty common in the sense that what most cultures say is good and right usually is good and right, and what most cultures say is wrong usually is wrong. There are some exceptions. I mean, some cultures have done some pretty brutal and horrific things, but even there, they have just found stupid ways to justify it. When you find a culture that, say, commits genocide and things along those lines, they tend to do it by claiming that the people they're committing genocide against are subhuman, that they're not human. So they'll say, yeah, it's wrong to murder human beings, but those guys over there aren't human beings, so it's okay for us to go kill them. Or, but those guys over there are doing horrific things, so now we're justified in going and killing them, and so on and so forth. They'll generally agree with you that it's wrong to kill human beings, and then they'll try and make excuses for why they do it. So moral epistemology is a question of how we come to know what is right or wrong, and how we determine what is right or wrong. It's questions like that. Whereas moral ontology, which is what this argument appeals to, is a question of, well, why is it the case that even anything is right or wrong? And the reason why this argument seems just intuitive, and I think works, is that Well, if there isn't a God, if there's nothing supernatural, then why should anything be right or wrong? It's the David Hume's is-ought problem. There's no real way to just get from an is, a statement of facts about the way things are, from that alone to an ought. If the world was completely naturalistic, there's no God, there's no supernatural things or nothing like God, it seems that we would be stuck in is, and it just be the way things are. And yet when we look around at the world, pretty much everybody, I'd say almost 99% or more, all have very distinct ideas about the way things ought to be. We do have moral intuition that we just see all the time. We'll look at evil things and say, that ought not be so. We'll look at good things and say, that's right, that ought to be. In fact, it ought to be more than just the way we see. So we'll see somebody behaving in a loving, kind way and say, well, that ought to be the way it is. That ought to be everybody. Or see something evil and say, that ought not be so. And it's just really difficult to see how it can be that it just really is the case that some things are morally right and some things are morally wrong, absent there being some kind of an ontological foundation for it, the best candidate for which is typically thought to be God. It seems to me that the only real way to deny this consistently is to turn around and say, well, morality doesn't really exist. It's an illusion foisted on us by evolution to help with, say, reproduction and things along those lines, which there are good arguments against, but at least if somebody says that, they're being consistent. So I think the reason why this tends to be a fairly compelling argument is it's just the case that all of us tend to look at the world and just intuitively and obviously see that there's a moral dimension to it. And that's been the experience for not just me and not just you, but the vast, vast majority of human beings who have ever lived. And you can take this a little further in that, generally speaking, the people who've denied that there's a moral dimension to the world, you can usually see how it was in their self-interest to do so. They tended to be people who wanted to behave in ways that, say, the society around them or the people around them were saying, that's immoral, and so then these people turned around and said, well, there is no morality. Or some of them were like dictators who'd murdered all kinds of people, and so obviously they wouldn't want to claim there's morality either. I won't claim that this is always the case, but every case that I'm aware of where there's been somebody who's been denying that there's a moral dimension in life, saying morality is just an illusion, it's not real, it's always been in there. They've always had a vested interest in doing so. And so that naturally, I think, should make us a little suspicious of them, especially when they're running up against the vast preponderance of human experience, which is there's a moral dimension to life. So this argument is, if there's a moral dimension to life, it needs an ontological status. It needs something to ground it. And the best candidate for grounding that moral component to life is God. And that's the first premise. If there is objective morality, there must be a God. And 2, there is objective morality, which again, pretty much 99% of humanity agrees with. 3, therefore there's God. And it's a valid argument. It's a pretty good argument, I think. And there's many variants of it given by many different philosophers. And again, you can find more and less sophisticated ones. This is a pretty simple one. Maybe at some point I'll come back to this and talk about some more sophisticated ones. But I tend to think that this is a pretty good argument. You can find versions of it that are poor, but you can do that with every argument. The objections to it just tend to be counterintuitive to human experiences. As I said, we all just intuitively see there's a moral dimension to life, and it's perfectly obvious when you just stop and think about it that for morality to work, it needs something to ground it in, and society and things along those lines just really don't work when you spell it out. If it's grounded in society, well, what happens when two societies compete against each other? So in World War II, if morality is grounded in society, America had no cause to say that the Nazis were wrong, because that was a different society. The morality would be different, and so on and so forth. You can extrapolate that problem into many different scenarios. There has to be an objective moral standard that's over and above all men in order for us to turn around and say, no, that's wrong. And so that's how the basic moral argument, that's how it works. And so now, time to let me know what you think. Do you find the moral argument compelling like I do? Did you find my explanation of it good, bad? You didn't really care? What do you think about the problem of divine foreknowledge? Do you tend to go with a Molinist option, a divine timelessness option, an open theistic option? Are you a Calvinist, or do you like simple foreknowledge? Or do you not like any of those and have kind of developed your own option like I do? What do you think of my option of just denying the problem by just pouring a little deeper into what knowledge and free will are and saying, well, when you look at these definitions, there just doesn't seem to be a problem here? So as always, write in and let me know what you think. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and you can reach me at the Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. And hey, if you like this episode, share it on your social media pages and let other people know about it so more people can learn about the problem of divine foreknowledge. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you all again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.